Good afternoon and a warm welcome to session number 2. This is the Priorities Emerging from Global Trends 2030 and Beyond. Thank you all for being with us at this year's Summer University. Throughout the session, we encourage you all to submit your questions through the chat box. Please do so. And the audience should also make sure that they are on mute, and the speakers, of course, that they aren't. This session is recorded and streamed, so therefore we are not operating under the Chatham House rule. And I would like now to introduce you to the session moderator, Lord Syed Kamall. He is a member of the House of Lords and a professor for international politics and international relations at St. Mary's University in Twickenham. He will introduce our speakers and moderate the session. So over to you, Syed. Thank you for chairing.
And Felix, thank you very much. And can I also thank Ideas Network 2030 for inviting us today. Now, for this session, I'm delighted to be joined by Matt Burrows, who's the Director, Foresight Strategy and Risks Initiative, and co-director of the New American Engagement Initiative at the Atlantic Council. And also in this session is Franck, the Director for Library and Knowledge Services in the DG European Parliament Research Service, and a member of the steering group of the European System for Policy Analysis and Strategy. In a moment, I'm going to ask Matt, then Franck, to share their thoughts for up to about 10 minutes, each on what they see as the priorities emerging from Global Trends 2030 and beyond, drawn on work already done by the Ideas Network 2030. After that, I may well ask 1 or 2 questions before moving on to questions from the audience. And then I'll then aim to wrap up the session in about 55 minutes time to hand back to Felix in time for the next session. Can I remind viewers that you can submit questions using the box below the video at any time? Do not feel that you have to wait until both speakers have presented. Also, please remember, as Felix said, this session is being recorded. So Matt, can I hand over to you to kick us off, and then I'll ask Franck afterwards. Matt, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. And also thank you, the whole Ideas Network, for inviting me. So, you know, one of the problems with global trends is that you have, a huge smorgasbord of different priorities and almost too many. And that's been the problems for governments when they're looking ahead, is that there's just so much out there that is both opportunity, but I would say also in many cases a challenge. So I'll tick through about 5 or 6 that I see as very urgent in many ways. And some of these I know are already on your agenda for later sessions. So first on tech, I mean, this is, as we've seen in the pandemic, we've seen how vital it is, both for continuing our daily lives, but also for finding the antidote and getting vaccines developed in warp-like speed. I mean, that's something that we really should be patting ourselves on the back. I mean, this, you know, in years back, I mean, we would never have seen the progress we have had, even though there are obviously some big problems still ahead. But there's an aspect of tech that I know has been around for some time, and something that is going to accelerate, and that deals with automation and robotics and what that means for the future of work. We have seen, particularly in advanced economies, how the displacement of workers have had huge implications politically, socially. In my country and in the US, in Europe and elsewhere, we've seen wages stagnate for lots of workers, in large part because even if their jobs aren't eliminated, there's been enough of their jobs that have been taken away that they haven't seen advancement, and we lack, particularly, I would say, in the US, training programs to really get people back on a path towards higher wages and better opportunities. So that issue is going to be with us. It's with us now, but it's going to be even bigger problem, I think, as the pandemic, if anything, will give a boost to to this automation. We've seen businesses extremely interested in how to use technology to change, automate their functions. Second part of that, and again, we know it's around, it's an issue, but we really haven't found the magic solution. And that is the problem with disinformation, which obviously is undermining democracies. It's not going to go away. And at the same time, we don't want to heavily regulate, particularly in the U.S., the tech sector. We don't know. We also have, a strong attachment to free speech. So there are various barriers there to how we deal with this issue. But it is, I would say, one of the key issues for our times. The final part of it, and I'll just briefly mention, is on climate change. Obviously, a lot of us see tech as at least part of the solution for climate change. I don't think it may not be the total solution, the way that, lots of people in the US hope that we don't have to sacrifice anything. We just find tech solutions. I don't really agree with that view. I think there will be needed sacrifices to how we lead our lives, and some of them will be very painful. But we nevertheless, tech is going to have to be part of the solution. So moving on, so the big one, and coming out of the Afghan crisis, I think it's all on our minds, is really the U.S. role in the world. I think in many ways we've been surprised in this country how Biden is a lot like Trump, that basically he is withdrawing a lot from the Middle East. It's just not Afghanistan. It's recentered on China, which was, one of Trump's big issues, and that is ramped up. If anything, Biden talks about allies and partners in a way that Trump didn't. But we've also seen disregard for allies in the Afghan crisis. So, and you have a public that is disenchanted with basically the foreign policy or the way it was led in the last couple decades, a feeling that obviously Trump used of the U.S. being taken advantage of by others. So degree to which we have a more engaged view with just other regions besides Asia and other issues besides China, I think is an open question. I have been critical of the slowness with which the U.S. has really offered vaccines to the rest of the world, even though we have a huge surplus of them. That seems to me to be contrary to kind of where we were after the Second World War, when we were thinking about others as much as we were ourselves. The China issue is a big one, and it's interesting that the Biden administration has found no way of talking about cooperation with China. The rhetoric has been always negative, and they don't really, even on climate change, where there is some effort to reach out, they're still very wary of cooperating with China. And I think if the U.S. continues on a line of hostility, just pure hostility to China, that potentially ends up in this new Cold War, which would be a disaster for everybody. And that I think, we'll see what happens in the next year or two, but the U.S. has to find a way of living with China. I mean, it is a rising power. It's going to be, whether it actually continues to rise at the same speed, it's still going to be a a huge factor, and actually a failed China would be actually more of a challenge for everybody in the world. So finding some way of coexistence, despite obviously our differences, I think is a huge priority. Final one, and I know I'm coming at the end of my 10 minutes here, is on deglobalization. So what we've seen with the pandemic is the developing world being hit in a way that it looks like the advanced economies won't be. And those include China as well, that we've seen growth pick up a lot. Obviously, that is dependent on the vaccination, higher rates of vaccination anyways. So if you're looking at, the developing world, a lot of that middle class in the developing world sinking back into poverty, that has obviously its big implications. Are we going to look at much more state failures? Is that kind of instability in the developing world going to lead to more migration? And how do we deal with that in the advanced economies? So this, and climate change on top of which we know will probably hit the poorer countries even harder than the advanced countries, although we're seeing the effects really of extreme weather already in spades during this summer in the US. So these are, global, where we end up if it's a split world, developed, non-developed, turning back the positive accomplishments over the past couple of decades, that would be a terrible legacy that the pandemic leaves. And that issue, I think, for our own interests, we need to try to solve. I'll stop here.
Well, Matt, thank you very much for that introduction. I think that sets it up very nicely. So let me hand straight over to Franck, and then I'll come back with for the audience questions and my own questions. Franck, over to you. The floor is yours.
Many thanks, Kamall. Happy to be finding again myself with Matt and continuing a discussion that is now lasting for a good 15 years. Just to bring back a few things from Brussels, on which key assumption has the European Union leadership been working with what kind of things on mind have been working for now the last 5 years. Basically, 4 elements were on the map for the future. The first one was on the economy, the risk of slow growth, or even the risk of slow growth in the West, as higher growth rate would be experienced somewhere else. This was what the economists would call the Japanese model. So slow growth, and slow growth with high debt. And this was a preoccupation before the COVID, and you can imagine that this is now a worse preoccupation after the COVID. This is the very reason why there is so much investment in making the recovery strong and robust and fast. People could think we are crazy investing so much money, keeping our different sectors more or less as they were before the crisis and not leaving nature do its own trip. But we keep them alive at high cost with the expectation that this will help to have a speedy, substantial growth recovery. So growth is really on the map, and everything you can do to avoid a period of slow growth with high debt, maximizing the use of the digital transformation and the deeper fourth industrial revolution that is coming to our place is clearly on the map. Second thing on the map, even more difficult to fix, is the growth of inequality within our society, not only in the West, but also somewhere else. It doesn't mean that because we have a growing middle class in the emerging economy, inequality are not also increasing there, but the increase of inequality in the West, in the US, in Europe is really a challenge, not only for education, but also for the welfare system we have in the past. Both our current education system and our welfare package do not seem anymore able to fix it. And of course, with COVID, we have seen that any crisis is affecting first the less able to have access, the poor neighborhood. The maps of political geography are very clear. COVID crisis was also a social crisis, and we are exiting out of this crisis with no easy solution on this one. The third one is, of course, and now we are living in it for a few years, the end of the Cold War. So it's the end of peace. Some have said this is a new multipolar world or multinodal world. What does it mean? It means that on many issues, the decision is not only in the West, that local power, regional power, play an increasing role, that they are in for also confrontation, sometimes cooperation, like maybe we see in Central Asia, confrontation and cooperation at the same time of regional power, and the ability of the West to bring peace, to bring stability is reduced because we have new games, much more subtle, being played, which sometimes we understand, which sometimes we assess in a less appropriate fashion. And the fourth priority is, of course, climate change and the acceleration. But what we have discovered, and I think the discovery is still on, we're still in the learning phase, is that with the COVID crisis and the previous crisis, that was the migration crisis, we have learned the high level, higher than expected level of dependency, not only industrial, but also for us Europeans, and we're still together, the two sides on the channel on this, dependence on security arrangement, dependence on our allies, dependence, energetic dependency, which has not improved recently, much the opposite. And as you discover yourself more dependent, also technologically, from outside, you wonder if you have the right kind of toolbox to face the risk of the future. And this is the new type of thinking we have in the Union now, at least in Foresight, to see in front of risks that are likely to happen and risks that are likely to have impact, what kind of toolbox we have in front of it. National level, EU level, with our allies, and this is a kind of a new thinking that is appearing. So it's not only analysis of global trend like we did in the past, but something closer to what the business is doing, risk assessment and planning to see how we can fix the different tools we have. Just an example, because it was illustrated by one of the vice president of the Commission, Šefčovič. We discovered with this risk analysis that we are very short on battery, for instance, as we were discussing just before hydrogen. So if you don't want to be fully dependent in 10, 15 years from outside supplier, what you do with batteries. It doesn't sound like great politics, but in fact it is. It is, and the European Commission invested a lot of energy, the previous one and the current one, in creating a new coalition between the private sector, member state, the union, different actors that were not used to speaking together to deliver a kind of resilience capacity, at least an autonomous capacity on the battery. because this is the future of many industry. So we are changing from kind of long trend analysis, which is still valuable, to a more kind of risk assessment and capability building. The big challenge, and maybe this is the last priority, is really for us, and this was a lesson from the Afghan crisis, but also from the early stage of the COVID crisis, to come from description and system focus on the quality of description to action, bringing back intellectual power into delivering capacity for action. And I think this is really now a challenge for all of us on both sides of the channel. Thank you.
Well, Matt and Franck, thank you very much for those opening remarks, giving us plenty to talk about. I know also that some of the future sessions of this Ideas Network 2030 University will be discussed in more detail in some of the sessions. But let me just throw two questions at both of you, and then I'll bring in the audience. Can I also encourage you, if you are viewers, please do type in a question. There is no such thing as a stupid question. Please, that's quite something I often tell my students. So please do write in with some of your questions. So first one is really, how do you think the pandemic has affected the way that you look at the trends to 2030? What are you saying different? What are you saying now that is different to what you have said, what you would have said about 2030 before the pandemic? And you know, that's basically, why don't we start with that question? I'll start with Matt and then Franck.
Well, I think the big difference is, and I mentioned this before, is the fact we're quite optimistic about this middle class growing in the developing world. And at least in the next couple of years, it looks like, you know, there's estimates of 150 million or more who have dropped out of that middle class and are going back to poverty. So that is one of, I would say, the biggest. You know, most of the trends, and this usually happens with crises, is they've accelerated.
Yeah.
And you know, obviously we have a lot of the same issues. I mean, I was talking on the tech, on automation, robotics. I mean, that was there before, but you know, if anything, the tech show just how vital and how essential all the digital technologies are. And I think have opened people's eyes to the fact that there's so many more opportunities that can be exploited with them. But there are always these more negative effects, and we've seen that with you know, how a lot of unskilled workers and semi-skilled workers have really paid a price for their lack of training and also the ability to get retrained. Yeah.
Franck, what about you? You know, what are you saying now that is different to what you would have said before the pandemic?
Excellent question. We are less robust, less prepared, less autonomous than we had thought. And we were looking at the world as if we were a kind of Descartes kind of subject, looking at it as if we had no problem or just a few ones to solve. And in fact, we discovered that we can be very badly damaged in a very, very short period of time, that our economy can be brought to collapse, that society can go in very, very serious political and social trouble. We experienced that also with Islamic terrorism in part of our country before and during COVID, and very likely after COVID. So the robustness of our society in the West really has been tested, and the level of preparedness is now put into question. And we see it in the European Parliament. You're familiar with the question about how we were prepared at executive level, in the Commission, in the member state, is really on the lip of every member of the parliament, whatever the political color is.
Great. So one more question. Please, can I encourage viewers to submit your questions? So far on my iPad, I only have one question. I'm pretty sure that you are not all that shy and you've got lots of opinions. So please do submit your questions in the chat box. The second question, I suppose, is I was reading a paper yesterday and it was comparing the digital revolution with the green revolution. And what it was saying is that we're living through two revolutions at the moment. And with the digital revolution, that's incredibly popular with private, with consumers, private companies, the private sector, the market economy. People are buying iPhones, they're adopting the technology and very happy to. The problem with the green revolution, this paper was suggesting, was that it was very much government driven and people were seeing costs, replacing your old gas boilers with heat pumps, for example, buying more expensive battery electric or hydrogen cars, and almost being forced in that way. How do we make the green revolution more attractive to consumers so we all play our role? I think as Dieter Helmer said in his book on net zero, that it's not just politicians, we all have to play our role. Let me start with Franck and then we'll move to Matt. And then I'll move to the audience questions. Franck, what's your answer on this sort of green digital revolution? Is it?
There was an expectation 10 years ago that one way to reply to your question was to make the green revolution digital revolution and to allow all consumers to self-produce for the energy market, to go for smart grids and this kind of self-oriented production. So everyone could be a consumer, everyone could produce for the green market, and everything would be linked through smart grids, etc. This is not proving a reality. So very likely we have to expect for something different, and something different is very likely a more serious industrial revolution, that is the revolution of converging technology. So nanotechnology, information technology, and green technology coming together. And this is deep industry, strong science. This is something on which China is very good, investing heavily on biotech. And this is a revolution we cannot afford to lose. This is not only to bring together to the green revolution the large number of consumers, but also very large number of investors that are not short of cash in those days with low interest rates, but sometimes are short of ideas and opportunities.
And Matt, what about you? How do we make the green revolution more attractive to consumers? The digital revolution they're very excited about and spending their own money on it. The green revolution they see as a cost. How do we make that more more sellable?
I think we have to make sure that there's a fairness principle operating, that basically, all of us who have to change in some way and maybe also pay a price and in converting and changing some of the, how we heat or our homes and businesses. I think we have to make sure that there's a fairness of, a lot of people feel that they're going to lose out, even if they know the threats. And obviously, I think there's more and more evidence that it's not this theoretical future out there that will or may not come. So, but I think that's where I don't think government has been very good really about talking, how the fairness principle is going to be really adhered to. And for some people, they'll need help to convert over to the new technologies.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I was talking to someone who works with lots of projects in local communities, particularly in poorer communities. And she was saying to me, she's very much a green. She sees herself as a green, but where she draws the line is where it makes poor people even poorer. And that's one of the concerns that they have. Look, I'm now going to turn to the audience. I've got 4 questions. Please don't feel that you've been shut out. I'm pretty sure we can get through these 4 questions. So please feel free to add any more questions. Don't be shy, as I said, we can't see you. So first question from Cameron. Let me just make sure I've read it. Briginshaw. Apologies if I've mispronounced that. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to start the first question with Matt and then Franck, and then reverse the order for the following questions and keep alternating like that. So Cameron asks, it's often a talking point that we need to combat China, but what can the US do in order to quell China's growing influence over nations, especially those in the developing world? Matt, what's your view on that?
Well, I don't think at least the US has had much of a policy on development over the past decade. And as I said, I mean, even in the pandemic, the Biden administration was very slow to develop a vaccine diplomacy strategy. So, I think one thing, showing interest, the U.S. has also tended to, in this battle with Huawei, to threaten countries if they buy Huawei infrastructure or enter any deals with China involving Huawei, that the U.S. would cut this or that off with them, without actually there being an alternative, and certainly not an alternative that is low cost in any sense. So I do think that, we need our own Belt and Road project, one in which, it espouses more Western values, but actually gets the developing world is interested and goes along with China, even despite some of the disadvantages, because they see them as providing the needed infrastructure. So that's how to combat China in that area. Just offer a competing idea.
Matt, let me press you a little bit on that before I bring Franck in, and I'm interested in Franck's view on this. You say we've got to offer our own sort of Belt and Road initiative. When you say we, who's that? Is that the US? Is that the US and the EU and the UK? Is it Western nations?
I I think it's a good joint project between the US and EU. Right. EU has a much better record, I think, on development. But I think that's where we have to get together and think about. And obviously, there's some self-interest there too, because often with these unstable countries, this is where the migratory pressures come from.
I suppose one of the challenges there is when you think about, for example, the fact that one of the things that we were moving towards when it came to development aid was conditionality. We saw one reason for countries being poor was poor governance. Now China cuts through that. They give their aid almost unconditionally because they're after the resources or the markets in that country. Do you think we might have to sort of hold our nose and drop some of the conditionality in order to compete with China?
I think yes, but I think it's more than the conditionality. I mean, one problem, like with the World Bank funding, is that it's so slow. And I mean, there's a huge bureaucracy. And I mean, we also, have problems with AID, which is supposed to be doing development. It's run by contractors, and there's a huge bureaucracy involved in it, and that slows down the ability actually to get going on the projects.
Thank you. And Franck, sorry, you've been very patient, Franck. I'm sure you've got lots to say about this. Why didn't you come in? How do we combat China? Matt has talked from a US perspective. I hope you'll talk from an EU perspective. But what about that coalition that we have to build, Franck?
Yes, very likely we will not be competitive if we just start a competition with China on aid and political manipulation. They can put very likely more money, and they're more blunt than we are on political manipulation, where we still have something to do, very likely together. And this is what is in line with expectation of a large part of the population, is to offer opportunities for the companies of the developing world in our place, to offer access to education, to offer access to job in our place. But this needs some level of courage. We need to continue opening up our society making sure that people coming from third world country, developing country, are feeling at home in our place, even if they are not Christian, even if they are not sharing all our value, they need to feel at home. So we need a deep cultural revolution also in our place to be able to compete with China, to be seen as the place where the real opportunities are, the place with which you want to interact, the place with which you want to belong with your own identity. It is a long way to go, but here democracy are better equipped than authoritarian regimes.
Now, Franck, I think you raise an interesting point, and it just touches on something that I know many people have been looking at in the Ideas Network, is the idea of demography changes. Frankly, we are, we're not replacing ourselves enough in the European, wider European context. In many Western countries, in many developing countries, there are lots of young unemployed people. It makes sense to bring those people to our countries. Also, I know a development economist once said to me, you either take our goods and services or you take our people. But you have seen, and I have seen in the European Parliament, the resistance to inward immigration from outside Europe. It's very much Eurocentric immigration, but what about outside Europe? How do you think we meet that challenge, or does each country have to do it differently in their own way, and they're given their own history? What's your view, Franck? Because it's a real challenge for us, isn't it?
We are still missing a kind of blue card in the European Union. So an easy way, there was a lot of work by the Juncker's Commission, there is still work going on to offer a safe path for working migrants that want to come and have a chance in our society, starting with higher education and then being able to stay for a period of time. We have not managed yet to organize a process that allows for it. And this is really something where we may pay the price if we don't get our acts together pretty fast. No? We have had a few wake-up calls with the crisis 5 years ago. We now have not only Afghanistan and Central Asia, but also the Middle East knocking on our door. And we have very soon, very likely, the Sahel knocking again on our door. So we better get ready. And I know that this is not that there are no efforts in the Commission, but in many member states, because of electoral reasoning, pressure of populism, we are shy to go the way we need to go.
Yes, it reminds me of some of the conversations I used to have with Jean-Claude Juncker about these issues. He used to point out to Luxembourg, point me to the example of Luxembourg. And he said, what percentage of that of Luxembourg were immigrants, the workers? And he said, why doesn't everyone else accept it? And I remember the group I led, the ECR, we had parties that said to me, well, hold on a minute, we never had these colonies or anything like that. We're very happy to accept Ukrainian immigration, etc., but we don't want non-European immigration, and it's a real challenge there. And I think you're seeing some of this play out. So let's move on to the next questions. I've got an Alex B. I've got a feeling I know who that is, but I'll make no assumptions. And let's start with you, Franck, and then Matt. It says, Franck, you said that inequality within industrialized countries was a key long-term concern. What do you think that the most important effects of persistent or worse inequality will be over the coming years? If we don't address inequality, what do you think it will lead to in the long term, Franck?
We will have apartheid.
Right.
We will have apartheid, and apartheid will also have a racial or identity dimension. I'm very worried that some of our poorest community are not the community with deep roots in Europe. And if this remains the case, we risk a fragmentation of our society and a terrible loss of efficiency in our democracy, with a part of the population not considering that this is home.
Yeah, very interesting. I remember I was, when I used to do a lot of politics in London, I remember there were some areas where you had social housing estates right next to quite expensive houses in London. And one of the things that the local councillors would say to me is, there's a real challenge even at the local level. As if we have too much inequality, those people will start asking, is society unfair? and then you'll get a breakdown in those community relations. They can't speak to each other, and that happens at all levels. Matt, I'm going to bring you in here. What are your concerns about the long-term impact of inequality?
Well, I think you eventually end up with a class which feels very desperate, having no hope, and certainly we've seen already in the U.S. over the last couple of years and a real beginnings of a new protest movement, and one that has issues that Franck was talking about on race, because there is a section, as I said before, of the middle class in the U.S. that feels that they're losers, and I think that would deepen and cause some over time instability.
And I suppose there's another issue here, which is traditionally we used to think about the poor, people in poverty, as people who didn't have jobs. And it used to be said, the best way you can help someone in poverty is to give them a job. Now, what we now find is that we have the working poor, and people are working and they say, I'm working really hard, but I still can't make ends meet. That's a real challenge, isn't it, Matt? How do you guys think about it in the States?
Well, I think you're right. I think the pandemic also highlighted that, because the people who were working, at their workplace were the ones that were at the most risk. So and they're paid minimum wage. So, you've seen, I think, and we've seen some progress in the past few months of states raising their minimum wage. The other thing that you've seen is the scramble by businesses to get workers back, and they've had to raise their wage levels to do that. I think where we haven't made too much progress is on the retraining. I mean, I think there will, some of the people who get back into the work stream are going to have increased benefits just because there's such a demand for workers. But there are 6 million jobs that haven't been filled. There still is a relatively high unemployment rate for the U.S. There's a lot of worry that there were quite a few people that dropped out during the pandemic, got discouraged them, and don't have an intention to get back into the workforce. And that's a problem at a societal level, but I think also when you're talking about the inequalities.
Great. Okay, let's move on we've got 2 more questions. Please feel free, if you're in the audience, to submit some more questions. And can I also ask John Knights, who has submitted a question, could you kind of elaborate what you mean by your question, just so when I put it to the panelists? Next question, and I'm going to apologize for mispronouncing this. I get this all the time. People mispronounce my name. Is it Franck Nigriello or Nigriello? I apologize. I know Franck has been very supportive of Ideas Network as well. So Franck, thank you. And I'm going to put your question first to Matt and then to Franck. He says, we've discussed many trends that are concerns or issues for the future, but what are the 1 or 2 major opportunities that exist for the UK and Europe, either individually or in partnership? Matt, how do you see that? And then Franck, I'll bring you in.
Well, certainly, I think the first opportunity out there is to mend fences, and to establish some areas really of cooperation, because as we've discussed, a lot of the problems are similar. In fact, they're similar in the U.S. So thinking about future of work, retraining, there are lessons that the UK can absorb from European countries. I mean, we talked a little before this event on apprenticeships in Germany. That is a practice that the UK could, and actually the US could should look at and should think about adopting. I think on the disinformation problem, that's one that we're all a victim of, and there needs to be actually some cooperation on how we deal with that, what kind of things we are going to ban in social media. That should be something that is taken a position that is common across all, US, UK, and EU. So to my mind, I mean, now we've had Brexit, we've had some issues on Northern Ireland. I mean, we need to get to the part where we think about, okay, UK is not in the EU, but how can we still cooperate on common issues?
Yeah, it's something I often say to a lot of my friends here, on both sides of the channel. If Britain or UK had never joined the EU, we are neighbours. We would have worked together on some issues. We would have disagreed on other issues. That's how we should treat that relationship, as as allies where we can be. Franck, how do you see it? And I'll just go back to Franck's question, which was, what are the one or two major opportunities that exist for the UK and Europe, either individually or in partnership?
Yes, one opportunity, it's too early to say if we will use it to the max, is to create something that didn't exist, which is a unified capital market. In a capitalist economy, when you don't have a capital market, it's not good. And this is the opportunity that is just around the corner for the single market and all around the single market, that obviously should be most welcome in this single capital market. There is a lot of effort to build it now. With the financial crisis, it was delayed. The recent crisis makes it to a certain extent easier because we are doing capital easing anyway. So we have low interest rate, we have not shortage of cash. What we need is not a regulatory framework, and we hope a British business sector will join into the venture to have really a capital market in Europe, as there is one for a long time in the US, which has delivered a large part of American growth. So this is an untapped opportunity that is around the corner, and one in which regulation for one can help dramatically to improve the scene. Some study point that this is 1 or 2% additional GDP per year if we manage to have it, and that you don't need a very complex banking intermediation to bring a nice, good investor from Britain to a golden opportunity in the Czech Republic. We need to do it better in Europe and around Europe.
Thank you. Franck, I'm going to come to you first. This is John Knight, and John Knight has very kindly elaborated on his question. So John Knight says, your guest speakers have spoken at least as much about people as technology or climate. Yet we often don't focus on the fact that societal issues are at the core, because as humans, we are more comfortable with solving problems that we can approach rationally rather than emotionally, spiritually. Now, given all this, and we mentioned the green and technical revolutions, what about the social revolution, which is sometimes impacted by technology and the climate? Isn't that not more important to our survival? So how do you feel about that? And especially sort of the emotional, spiritual side, how do the experts feel about that? Franck, I'm going to start with you, then I'm going to move to Matt. And please, I think we might have time for another one or two more questions. So please do not be shy, and let's see who can squeeze another question in. But over to you, Franck.
Yes, what did we call social revolution? We had 7 years ago a very interesting study by Around Europe for the European System for Policy Analysis and Strategy. This is the topping together of different evolution. Aging first, it is full of opportunity. We have a second adult age. Between 50 and 75, we have basically another generation able to work, able to contribute, not retired, keeping in many places society together. Look at who is responsible at church. Look at who is responsible in politics. Look at who is responsible in trade union. You have a chance that this is a person between 50 and 75. So aging is not only a problem. Second part is a more mobile family structure. More divorce, but also remarriage, more flexibility than before. And this is also an opportunity for geographical mobility. The last point is a more diverse society, not one size fits all society. And this was the expectation of many generations before our generation, not to be clustered in a kind of village-like atmosphere where everyone had to abide by the same rule. So these three elements are providing a vast number of opportunities for individual, family, social group, providing there is trust in society, provided individuals have access to education and credit. And access to credit is by no means the last important thing.
And Matt, what about you? You've heard the question, you've heard Franck's response. What's your view on John's position or John's question about what about the social revolution and the emotional, spiritual dimension and just the green or digital revolution?
Well, I think that's very, the social revolution, I think we've talked about. I mean, Franck just talked about some of the opportunities that have come with the changing demographic structures. I think on the spiritual and religious, I mean, we have in the U.S. a long history of religious awakenings that actually release a huge amount of energy, and you will find that that still motivates huge segments of American society, who remain, among the advanced countries, one of the still most religious country. I do think that there are some issues connected with that, bigotry, prejudice, discrimination. And we have to be, there's as I said, a very positive side of the spiritual and religious experience, but there's also, has been traditionally, a more negative side. And this gets to maybe Franck's point of diversity and tolerance. That needs to be part of any of the emotional, spiritual transformations that happen. And I think that is one of the hardest. And we've seen even with children, teenagers, enormous amount of violence against people or, other teenagers who don't seem to fit in. So learning to tolerate others, I think, is a key message here.
Great. Well, we're coming up to the 55-minute mark, so I'm going to ask you both a final question, a quick fire, 2 answers. I'm just going to start with Matt, then Franck, before I hand back to Felix. So Matt and Franck, the first one is, what are you most excited when you think about the trends at 2030, towards 2030, and what are you most concerned about? Matt, and then Franck.
I think the ones that we're most excited about deal with technology and opportunities there for huge strides and you'd say for all peoples. There are benefits there, and I think we've seen with, as I said before, with the pandemic, just how much tech is an opportunity for us, as well as a savior for our society and our livelihoods and our welfare. So I think that's the big one to opportunity, but it's also one that we have to get right, and that includes the fairness part of it, so that it's just not an elite. The one that I'm probably most worried about is the U.S. falling into a new Cold War with China.
Right. Sure. Thank you. And Franck, very quickly to wrap up, what are you most excited about? What are you more concerned about?
Globalization of culture and science, exciting, need clearly to be fixed. And part of it is the global demand for justice. There is a tremendous demand across the world for something more fair, for justice of all kinds. And this is fuel for a democratic revolution that has not completely happened with the Arab Spring, that is still in the pipeline in many places. It's not over. We should not look at the Taliban experience like having killed once and for all the democratic expectation. What is worrying is the security vacuum we're feeling.
Matt and Franck, it's been a fascinating conversation. I hope the audience have enjoyed it too. Thank you also very much to the audience for your challenging questions. It kept us going over the last hour. As I said, please stay tuned for this afternoon. We've got more exciting sessions, but to move you on to the next session, maybe you'll have a time for a quick cup of tea or coffee in between. I'm going to hand you back to Felix. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Syed, and thank you for your chairmanship. And above all, of course, thank you to Matt and Franck for being with us and sharing your insights from both sides of the Atlantic. That was absolutely fascinating to be part of this.